The ideology of the West has dominated the world for several centuries. Often the political philosophy behind the West is tied to Christianity. After all, Europe, the continent from which Western philosophy sprung, is deeply intertwined with Christianity. Three famous thinkers, Edmund Burke, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, represent three tenets of Western thinking. How do their ideas stack up to Christian ideas? Does God have a favorite form of government? Well, all three thinkers have different worldviews. Christianity heavily influenced all of them. Western political philosophy would not exist without the concept of rights. Rights are foundational. Historian Larry Seidentop investigated what built the West in his book Inventing the Individual: The Origins of Western Liberalism. Quote, "The idea of individual rights is the West's most distinctive moral achievement," unquote, he said. The American form of government represents the accumulation of Western thought. In the Declaration of Independence, the founders wrote, quote, "All men are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights," unquote. Of Burke, Locke, and Rousseau, Locke certainly had the greatest influence on the American founders. His most famous work, the Second Treatise on Civil Government, formed the basis of the American form of government. Locke begins his book by discussing what he calls the state of nature. The state of nature, he says, is the rights and duties men have to each other without any government. Based on his description of the state of nature, he later outlines how government ought to function. In this state of nature, Locke argues, men have full freedom in their, quote, actions and possessions. Quote, "within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man," unquote. Each man deserves this right because, quote, "nothing is more evident than that creatures of the same species should also be equal to one another without subordination or subjection," unquote. According to Locke, equality between men is a fundamental truth. Equal rights form the basis of Western thought. Rousseau and Burke disagree on the idea of natural rights. Rousseau broadly agrees with Locke, stating in his book The Social Contract that, quote, "no man has a natural authority over his fellow, and force creates no right," unquote. Burke entirely contests this claim, mocking revolutionaries in his book Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke sarcastically uses their language, quote, "against these rights of men, let no government dare set up their tyranny," unquote. The theorists who built governments on fundamental rights, Burke believed, were delusional. Although Burke acknowledged the existence of rights, he believed tradition is more dependable than human reason. Rights only arise when institutions protect those rights. For that reason, Burke put institutions first, not rights, in contradiction to Rousseau. Western political thought is intertwined with the idea of rights. But Western theorists didn't invent rights. Throughout the Old Testament, God describes a system of rights for the Israelites. In the Ten Commandments, the Israelites' most fundamental law, God bans murder and thievery. Restated positively, he protects the rights of life and property. Specific Israelite laws elaborate on these basic principles. Leviticus 25 repeatedly recognizes land ownership as legitimate. Similarly, Numbers 35 instructs the Israelites to organize cities of refuge, designed to protect those who accidentally kill their neighbors in accidents. The concept of cities of refuge recognizes both a right to punish wrongdoing and the wrongness of taking an innocent life. Using these biblical premises, Locke expands on these ideas. Quote, "reparation and restraint," unquote, says Locke, "are the only justifications to invading the rights of another man." Men cannot invade each other's rights unless given reason to do so. Reparation involves the criminal paying for the victims of his crime in order to right his wrong. Thieves should repay what they take. Like Exodus 22, verse 4 says, quote, "Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution," unquote. The justification for invading another's rights is restraint or punishment. Punishment, Locke continues, should be to a degree that the crime is, quote, "an ill bargain to the defender, to the offender," unquote, and will, quote, "terrify others from doing the same, while giving him cause to repent," unquote. Rousseau agrees that men cannot arbitrarily invade each other's rights, as he says, quote, "Let us then admit that force does not create rights, and that we are obliged to obey only legitimate powers," unquote. Locke and Rousseau agree that human rights exist and that to be legitimate, institutions must respect those rights. Burke disagreed. Rights, he said, are an illusion, a theory. Quote, "The pretended rights of these theorists are all extremes, and in proportion as they are metaphysically true, they are morally and politically false," unquote. Instead of rights, Burke leaned on tradition. He judged political movements on their adherence to tradition, not their loudly proclaimed metaphysical ideals. Tradition is proven to work. New theories are not. To be clear, Burke did not despise change. As he wrote, quote, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation," unquote. Where Burke disagreed was with a subset of revolutionaries. When these men saw that change was necessary, they observed, as he described, quote, "nothing in that but deviation from the Constitution." And they take deviation from the principle for the principle, unquote. In other words, revision is not the same as destruction. Change is not the same as obliteration. Without institutions, rights are meaningless. Rousseau recognized that institutions are necessary. However, he was more particular about what types of institutions are just. Quote, "We must conclude that consent forms the basis of all legitimate authority among men," unquote, he wrote. When men consent to a government, they create what Rousseau calls, quote, "the social contract." This contract forms the basis of all just governments. Under this contract, quote, "each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will." He continues, "The general will alone can direct the state according to the object it was created, the common good," unquote. Only one form of government can represent the common good, Rousseau believed. That would be a republic, which he defined as, quote, "every state that is governed by laws," unquote. While Rousseau was extremely vague on how a republic should work, he clearly held that to be just, a state must be governed by laws. A similar theme of a state governed by laws is present in the Bible. Daniel Eleazar, director of studies on federalism at Temple University, writes in an article for the journal Tradition, quote, "The biblical discussion of the government of ancient Israel stands at the very beginning of Western political life and thought," unquote. Israel was the first nation to ever recognize that rights come from God. Other nations like Babylonia and the Hittites were governed by laws, but they believed that rights came from above, down from their king. And if rights come from a king, a temporary human being, then those rights can change. If rights come from God, who is unchanging, then they're dependable. This is exactly what first set Israel and then the West apart. A dependable, moral set of rights creates a just society. A short history of Israel's governance demonstrates its distinctiveness. At first, as Israel became a nation, God governed them through a consistent set of laws, the Ten Commandments. The law came from God, and everyone, including the leaders, were subject to it. Directly after giving the Ten Commandments, God gave Moses the Covenant Law, another set of laws detailing property rights, individual responsibility, and the laws of justice. Later, in both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Moses receives further laws for Israel. Throughout the entire period, Israel is ruled by a set of laws, not a king, entirely distinct from other nations around it. Finally, the Israelites plead for a king, and God allows them to select one. Still, the Israelites knew that their rights did not come from their king, but from God. Prophets like Nathan and Elijah criticized their kings for failing to follow the law. That was only possible because throughout its history, Israel recognized a higher law than the words of the king. Locke's worldview, a higher law put in place by God and enforced by government, is highly compatible with the biblical worldview. This makes perfect sense because Locke was a strong Christian. He started with biblical principles to build his science of government. Clearly, laws and rights are just. Simply recognizing this fact, though, does not build a society. Locke says that the first act of society is to create a power to make laws, which he calls the legislative power. He writes that this law can't be arbitrary. It must conform to the law of nature, God's will. Stepping back, Burke, Locke, and Rousseau had very different ideas of government. Burke placed tradition first. Without tradition, he proclaimed a government is nothing. Locke's focus was on the question, what are the duties of government? His answer is that if it cannot protect the rights of its citizens, a government is nothing. Rousseau highlighted consent. Without consent, he said, governments are tyrannical. Despite their disagreements, Locke and Burke's worldviews are broadly compatible. However, past initial agreement on rights and laws, Rousseau drifts in a different direction. These three tenets of Western thought reflect three different arguments within Western civilization. Locke and Burke are compatible, because tradition can embrace rights. These thinkers at first glance seem to be opposites, though. Locke has abstract ideas about rights and justice, while Burke follows tradition. However, they appear opposed only because they deal with vastly different problems. Locke would say that tradition without rights is still wrong. Burke would say that rights without tradition is ridiculous. But the two principles can work together. For example, Burke supported the American Revolution because it reaffirmed many parts of the English tradition. As he wrote, quote, "The Revolution was made to preserve our ancient indisputable laws and liberties, and that ancient constitution of government which is our only security for law and liberty." Unquote. Although Locke and Burke focus on two different principles, rights and tradition, respectively, their worldviews can work together. In fact, the combination of rights and tradition is the idea that built the United States, a country seen as the clearest product of Western thought. As established earlier, the founders hardly agreed with Locke's concept of natural rights. They also agreed with Burke, recognizing that only tradition could protect these rights. Only, quote, visionary men, unquote, writes Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 6, an essay to persuade Americans to accept the Constitution. Only visionary men would be delusional enough to think that without tradition, a country could survive. Quote, momentary passions and immediate interests have a more active and imperious control over human nature, unquote, he continued. Because momentary passions have so much influence over human nature, human reason does not often prevail. That is why Hamilton and the other founders believed tradition was important. Wisdom from the past trumps reason in the present. Thus, alongside rights, America embraced tradition. Rousseau represents a divergent strain of thought. His worldview could be summarized as rights and reason, in contrast to the rights and tradition of Locke and Burke. As discussed earlier, Rousseau placed enormous trust in the social contract. However, his prized concept is a sort of no true Scotsman fallacy. In this fallacy, someone insists, "No Scots put sugar on their porridge." They reply, "My uncle is a Scot and puts sugar on his porridge." The original speaker, however, would double down, saying, "Well, no true Scot would do that." Rousseau's concept effectively commits this fallacy because he proclaims that a contract, established by the consent of the people, representing the general will and enforcing the common good, cannot err. Many counterexamples exist, however. Political parties and deceptive reporting can distort the general will, he admits. Still, he says that those do not represent a true social contract, just like the Scottish uncle who puts sugar in his porridge was supposedly not a true Scotsman. This fallacy is used to ignore errors in universal statements. Rousseau is clearly incorrect when he says that the social contract cannot commit errors. Either the social contract is an unattainable utopia, or it is a massive failure. Rousseau's ideas fail because he places too much weight on human reason. Tradition trumps reason. Reason isn't an evil principle. If reason is the guiding light of society, however, it leads to ruin. Despite society's best efforts, the reasonable path is not clear. Decision-making becomes clouded. An unchanging source of wisdom solves this problem. When God calls the Israelites to obey him, he is asking them to obey an unchanging law, not ever-changing reason. God is not King 2.0, a better version of any other king. Kings have shifting ideas, changing laws, and temporary authority. God is unchanging and all-powerful. Following tradition, wisdom of how the world has worked, leads countries to better conclusions than placing reason first. Taking a final look at Burke, his worldview understands the importance of tradition to society. He makes correct observations about the role of government. As he observes, it is dangerous to, quote, mistake deviation from the principle for the principle. Unquote. Christians should never celebrate tearing down the past. The past always carries wisdom that, if ignored, will cause pain to future society. Quote, society is indeed a contract, he says, but it is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between living, dead, and those yet to be born. Unquote. Respecting the past is a deeply biblical principle. Burke's worldview is compatible with a biblical one. John Locke also supported tradition. He understood that a system of rights could only exist under tradition. Parents are critical in teaching tradition, he believed, writing that the first paternal duty is education. Inheritances are another way for parents to direct their children. Finally, he believed that once one is a subject, they are a subject perpetually. Just like his ideas about rights, his support for tradition falls in line with a biblical worldview. The fifth commandment instructs the Israelites to, quote, honor your father and mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you, end quote. Following one's parents and respecting one's countries are the only lasting ways to preserve rights. Without tradition, rights will fail. Locke, and his biblically supported worldview, would agree. Fascinatingly, these three Western thinkers represent three strains of thought prevalent today. Political groups form around the banners of tradition, rights, and consent. Politics Is, a book giving definitions of various political concepts, defines conservatism as, quote, a political approach that supports traditional institutions and values practical solutions, unquote. Clearly, this would be Burke's camp. Meanwhile, Locke is a classical liberal, which politics defines as, quote, a philosophy that promotes individual rights and freedoms at the heart of politics. Conservatism and classical liberalism are not opposed. One highlights institutions and the other celebrates rights. Two concepts that in America are deeply intertwined. Finally, Rousseau is much harder to map onto the political landscape because he attracts adherents from several different camps. The reason for this is because of the flaw in Rousseau's theory. Because he places so much trust in human reason and consent, he gives a major amount of power to the sovereign. Often those who advocate Rousseau's general ideas of everyone should have a say and government should represent everyone use these phrases to gain power. Therefore, actual belief in Rousseau's ideas has faded away, but his language remains frequently used. Burke, Locke, and Rousseau continue to shape the West through their ideas. That brings the worldview analysis full circle. Burke predicted what an obsession with human reason would produce: a lust for power. Respect for tradition and acknowledgement of rights must come before a trust in human power. For that reason, Locke and Burke's ideas have proven crucial to the survival of the West, while Rousseau's ideas are deceitfully used by those who wish to destroy the West. Locke and Burke begin their political analysis with biblical principles and produce a biblical worldview. Their ideas produced great, God-fearing countries. Rousseau believed in a God, but a vague one. His vague belief in God results in a vague worldview, one which produces vague slogans used merely to seize power. Locke and Burke accurately predict the shortfalls in Rousseau's worldview. Across their analysis of rights, just government, law, and advocacy for rights, tradition, and consent, these three thinkers shaped the West. They produced lasting strains of thought present today. Conservatism and classical liberalism remain deeply influential, as does Rousseau's language. Unfortunately, Rousseau's ideas are incompatible with a biblical worldview because he places his trust in humans. The Bible supports Locke and Burke's worldviews because they recognize God's higher law. Locke provided the philosophical foundation for the American Revolution, a revolution which Burke energetically supported. Without these thinkers, America would look very different. Because of these thinkers, the political system of the world's most powerful country strongly agrees with the biblical worldview.